My wife secretly banned my entire family from our newborn, while her parents lived in our nursery. Then her own sister blew the whole thing wide open with screenshots that changed everything. The call from my grandmother came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, 3 weeks after our daughter was born. I was standing in the kitchen, still in the clothes I'd slept in, warming a bottle. My grandmother's voice was thin and careful, the way voices get when they're carrying something heavy. She said she'd fallen 2 nights before, said the surgery was scheduled for Thursday. She wasn't scared, she told me. She'd lived long enough not to be scared, but she wanted something. Just one photograph of the baby before she went under, so she had something to hold on to. I said, of course. I said I'd send something right now. My voice cracked a little on the words, and I turned toward the hallway to ask Jessica to hand me the camera. That's when I heard the bedroom door open. Jessica had been listening. She walked into the kitchen with her arms crossed, and her face already had that particular flatness to it, the one that meant the conversation was over before it started. She held out her hand, reached for my phone. I said, Jess, it's my grandmother. She's going into surgery. She said, give me the phone. I didn't. Not fast enough. She stepped forward and took it from my hand and held it to her ear. And I watched my wife holding our 3-week-old daughter's birth announcement photo on the counter behind her tell my 92-year-old grandmother that she was toxic, that she was guilt-tripping a new mother during the most vulnerable period of her life, that the behavior was manipulative and would not be tolerated. Then she hung up. She set the phone on the counter and looked at me the same way you look at a problem you've already solved. She said, you don't understand the bond between a mother and her child. I stood there for a long time after she walked out. The bottle was still warm in my hand. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of the baby monitor, and, from the nursery down the hall, the sound of Jessica's mother talking softly to our daughter in a voice she had never once used with me. Her parents had been at the house every day since we came home from the hospital. Her mother, Diane, had essentially moved into the nursery. She had a specific chair she sat in. She had snacks she kept in the mini fridge we'd put in there for night feeds. She had opinions about the mobile above the crib and had already rearranged it twice. Her father, Robert, had taken somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 photographs. Her 2 younger siblings, Caleb and Meredith, came and went on their own schedule, dropping by for dinner, staying through bath time, treating the house like a wing of the family compound they hadn't known they needed. And my family had not come inside once. Not once in 3 weeks. My parents lived 20 minutes away. My mother, Linda, had been sending careful, measured texts since the day after the birth. She asked when a good time might be. She offered to wear a mask. She said she'd wash her hands twice, use the entrance by the garage, stay as long or as short as Jessica needed. Jessica told me the mask offer was creepy, that she didn't want someone who felt the need to wear a mask around a newborn anywhere near the baby. I tried to explain that my mother was just trying to accommodate whatever rules Jessica wanted. Jessica said that offering to wear a mask was passive-aggressive, that it was a statement about germs and judgment and implied criticism, and she wasn't going to reward it with access. My sister Priya had flown in from Portland. She'd booked a red-eye, found a hotel 6 blocks from our house, sent a gentle text when she landed, asking if there was a time that worked. She waited 4 days. She never got through the front door. On the 4th day, she texted me privately to say she was going to catch an earlier flight home because she was running out of paid leave, and there was no point staying. She didn't say she was hurt. She didn't have to. That was the same week Jessica told me that if my mother showed up unannounced, she would call the police. I want to be precise about who I was in those first 3 weeks, because I'm not interested in making myself sound better than I was. I was exhausted. The baby, we'd named her Nadia, wasn't sleeping more than 90 minutes at a stretch. I was running on 4 hours a night and working remotely during whatever windows I could find. I was telling myself stories that made the situation easier to accept, that Jessica was anxious, that new mothers have the right to control their space. That Diane being there constantly was just cultural. Jessica's family was close-knit in a way mine wasn't, and maybe I needed to respect that rather than resent it. I'd been telling myself those stories for longer than I wanted to admit. Jessica and I had been together for 4 years before we got married. We'd met at a work conference in Austin. She was in marketing, I was in product development. We'd been seated at the same table at a dinner neither of us wanted to attend. She was funny and direct, and she had a particular way of reading people that I found impressive. We dated long distance for 8 months before she moved to be near me, and the 2 years that followed were good. Genuinely good. There were things I noticed and filed away. A rigidity about plans, a tendency to go quiet and cold rather than argue, a way she had of reframing disagreements so that her feelings were always the ones that had been dismissed. But I loved her, and I trusted her, and I believed the hard parts were manageable. Her sister Amy was the person who told me, a year after we got engaged, that Jessica had been engaged once before. His name was Derek. They'd been together 3 years. His mother, from everything Amy described, had been a genuinely difficult woman, controlling, critical, the kind of person who made every family gathering feel like an inspection. She'd had opinions about the wedding venue, the guest list, the apartment Jessica and Derek had chosen. When the engagement ended, Derek had broken it off, Amy said carefully, and I could tell she was choosing her words. Jessica had gone through something that changed her, not just grief over the relationship, something more structural, a decision, Amy said, a line she'd drawn for herself. She'd never let another mother-in-law near her children. I'd heard that from Amy, filed it, and chosen not to examine it too closely. I loved Jessica. I thought it was a wound from the past, not a blueprint for the future. That was my mistake. Looking back, the signs had been there well before Nadia was born. At our wedding, Jessica had arranged the seating so that my mother was placed at a table near the back with my great-uncle and two co-workers she'd never met, while Diane sat in the second row. When I pointed this out during the planning, Jessica said she was trying to balance family and friends and that I was reading into it. At Thanksgiving that year, she'd mentioned to my mother very casually that the holidays were going to be at her parents' house from now on, not a discussion, a notification. When my mother asked if we might alternate years, Jessica said she found the suggestion exhausting. There had been a comment early in the pregnancy that my mother was the kind of grandmother who would undermine parenting decisions, said with such certainty that it was impossible to argue with because it hadn't happened yet. I had smoothed all of it over, told my mother to be patient, told my sister that Jessica just needed time to feel secure, kept the peace by making myself smaller and hoping that once the baby arrived, things would settle. Instead, once the baby arrived, the ceiling came off. The exclusion of my family had not been reactive. That was what I still didn't know in those first 3 weeks. I thought Jessica was overwhelmed and defensive and operating from anxiety. I didn't know she'd been planning this. The first significant escalation happened in the second week, before the phone call with my grandmother. My mother had asked very carefully if she could come for an hour on a Saturday morning, just to see the baby, just briefly. I relayed the request to Jessica, and she said no. I asked why. She said she wasn't ready. I said my mother had been waiting 2 weeks. Jessica said that my making her feel guilty about her timeline was a form of emotional pressure, and that she needed me to stop. I said I wasn't trying to pressure her. I was trying to understand when my parents would be allowed to meet their grandchild. She said allowed was a loaded word, and that my choice to use it told her everything about where my priorities were. We went 3 days without speaking normally after that. She slept holding Nadia in the nursery. I took Diane's chair when she went home at night, sitting in the dark, listening to my daughter breathe. The second escalation came when I asked Jessica, reasonably, whether there was a timeline, a week, a month, something concrete I could give my parents. She said timelines for something this important were artificial. I said my grandmother was 92 and not in good health, and that I was genuinely worried about how long we had. She said I was using my grandmother's age to manipulate her. I said I wasn't. I was just stating a fact. She said the fact that I kept raising my grandmother when she'd already explained her feelings showed that I wasn't listening to her. I stopped raising it, filed it, kept going. The third escalation was Priya's visit. When I told Jessica that Priya had flown in and was asking to come by, Jessica said she didn't feel comfortable with overnight guests from out of town in the early weeks. I said Priya wasn't asking to stay over. She had a hotel. Jessica said the hotel was irrelevant, that Priya being in the city at all created pressure she could feel, and that pressure was bad for her milk supply. I said, and I regret how I said this, Priya flew across the country to meet her niece. Jessica looked at me for a long moment and said, that's Priya's choice, not my problem. When Priya flew home, I called her and started to apologize, and she said, don't. You don't need to. She sounded careful. She sounded like Amy had when she'd been choosing her words. The fourth escalation was the phone call. The night my grandmother called. The night Jessica took the phone from my hand and said the things she said. After she hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the nursery and looked at Nadia through the door and felt something shift. Something that had been loosening for weeks finally gave way. I didn't say anything that night. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about my grandmother and what she'd heard and whether she understood, and I decided she probably did because she was 92 and she'd seen everything, and that somehow made it worse. The next afternoon, Amy came by. She'd been at the house several times since Nadia was born. She was part of the family rotation, coming and going like the others, but this time, she came when she knew Jessica would be resting. She knocked on the back door, the one that opened into the kitchen, and when I let her in, she was already different. Her hands were doing something at her sides, fingers pressing against her palms like she was steadying herself. She didn't sit down. She said, I need to show you something, and I need you to not tell her I was here. I said, okay. She pulled out her phone. She opened a thread of text messages between her and Jessica. The first thing I noticed was the date. They went back to mid-pregnancy, months before Nadia was born. The second thing I noticed was the tone. Jessica had been bragging. There was a message from 2 weeks ago, 2 days after Priya had flown home, where Jessica described watching the process unfold. The word she used was exactly. She said it had gone exactly as planned. She said she hoped it taught Priya not to assume she had rights to the baby. She used the phrase, rights to the baby. She talked about the wasted plane ticket and the hotel money as if they were satisfying details in a story she'd written herself. There was a message from before the birth when they'd been discussing how to structure the first weeks, where Jessica had laid out the framework, her family present daily. My family told the timing wasn't right. She used the word indefinitely in a way that wasn't ambiguous. And then there was the message that I had to read 3 times before I believed what I was reading. It was from 6 weeks ago, during the 3rd trimester. Jessica was venting about my grandmother calling to congratulate us on the pregnancy. She said she dreaded the visits once the baby was born. She said she hoped, and these were her exact words, I read them 3 times. She hoped my grandmother would die before Nadia was old enough to remember her, so she'd never have to deal with the visits. I put the phone down on the counter. I put it down carefully, the way you put something down when your hands aren't quite steady. Amy was watching me. Neither of us said anything for a while. She said, I can't stay quiet about this anymore. I know she's my sister, but what she said to your grandmother on the phone yesterday, I heard about it from my mom, and my mom thought it was fine. She thought it was appropriate. She paused. I need you to know who you're dealing with. I asked her to send me the screenshots. She sent them before she left the house. She said she was sorry. She said it in a way that meant multiple things at once, and I understood all of them. I spent 40 minutes sitting alone at the kitchen table reading the messages again. Then I went to find Jessica. She was in the nursery, sitting in Diane's chair, nursing Nadia. The room was warm and dim. She looked up when I came in, and something in my face must have been different than usual because her expression changed before I said a word. I held up my phone with the screenshots visible. I said, I need you to explain these. She looked at the screen, looked at my face, and her very first move, was to ask who had sent them to me. Not to explain, not to deny, to find out who'd shown me. I said it didn't matter. She said it absolutely mattered, and she needed to know who had gone through her private messages. I said, you wrote that you hoped my grandmother would die before Nadia was old enough to remember her. She said the message was taken out of context. She said she'd been having a difficult pregnancy and venting to her sister, and the words didn't reflect how she actually felt. She said I was choosing to weaponize a private venting moment against her. I said, you planned this. Before she was born, you planned this. She said I didn't understand the pressure she'd been under. She said she'd had a traumatic experience with a controlling mother-in-law, and she'd been trying to protect her child and her mental health and herself, and that if I couldn't understand that, then I was failing her as a husband. I said, my sister wasted 4 days and hundreds of dollars and flew home without meeting her niece because you planned it that way. She reached for my phone. I stepped back. She said, Samir, give me the phone. I said, Amy already sent them to me. That was when she understood. Her face went through something I couldn't entirely read, rage and calculation arriving at the same moment. She stood up carefully, still holding Nadia, and she said that Amy had betrayed her and that this family was trying to destroy her and that she was done. She said I had a choice. Apologize to her and to her family. Commit to never involving my family with Nadia without her explicit permission, or refuse and discover what she was capable of. I said, I'm going to let my parents meet their granddaughter. I took Nadia to my parents' house that afternoon. I put her in my mother's arms at their kitchen table. My mother didn't cry until after, when I'd stepped outside to call my sister. My father stood in the doorway and watched his wife hold his granddaughter for the first time and didn't say much at all. Jessica called the police. The officers arrived at my parents' address 25 minutes after I got there. They asked if I was the father. I said yes. They asked if there was a custody order in place. I said no. One of them said, then you're good, and they left. Jessica's mother arrived 40 minutes after the police did. Diane pulled into my parents' driveway and got out of her car already talking. My father went to the screen door and stood there. She called me a kidnapper. She said she had a lawyer on speed dial. She said I'd be lucky to get supervised visits once a month by the time this was over. She said all of it loudly in the driveway, in full view of the neighbors. My father held his phone up and filmed every word. I stayed at my parents' house until dark. Then I drove home. Jessica had called reinforcements. Her entire family was in our living room. Robert pointing his finger at my chest before I'd fully closed the door. Diane standing behind him with her phone up, recording. Caleb and Meredith filling the corners of the room, adding mass to the confrontation. Everyone talking at the same time, building a wall of noise that was meant to disorient. Jessica was on the couch in the middle of all of it. She was holding Nadia. She had tears on her face, and she was looking at me like I was someone she didn't recognize. She had already told them everything, her version of everything. I could see it in how they looked at me. Not like someone they had questions about, but like someone they'd already decided on. She said clearly so everyone could hear, you can apologize to my family right now and commit to following my rules, or I will make the rest of your life very difficult. I looked at her. I looked at Nadia. I said, I'm not apologizing for introducing my daughter to her grandparents. She stood up. She walked to the bedroom. She locked the door. I spent that night on the couch. Through the wall, I could hear Nadia crying. I could hear Jessica moving around, not responding to me when I knocked, not answering when I said her name. I lay there for a long time listening to my daughter on the other side of a locked door and tried to understand how I'd gotten here. The next morning, I was at a family attorney's office by 9. I laid everything out, the texts, the police report, my father's video of Diane in the driveway. The attorney, a woman named Rebecca, who had a very particular kind of stillness that I found steadying, said that what I'd described constituted parental alienation conduct, and that I needed to document everything going forward. She said to open separate bank accounts immediately. She said to change nothing at the house, not my address, not my belongings, nothing, and to continue acting as a present, engaged parent. I drove home after the meeting to find that the bedroom lock had been changed. There was a note on the door, written on a notepad from the hotel where we'd spent our first anniversary, telling me I could sleep in the guest room until I came to my senses. I went to the guest room. I sat on the bed. I checked our joint bank accounts. Jessica had moved $63,000 into accounts in her name only. I found this out on my phone, sitting on the guest room bed, while Diane's voice carried through the wall from the nursery. Rebecca had told me to document everything. I documented everything. The custody hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, I was sleeping in the guest room, eating meals while Diane occupied our kitchen, going to work by 8, and coming home to a house that had been reorganized around my absence. Nadia was still there. That was the only thing that mattered. I was still present. I was still her father. I held her when Jessica allowed it, which was not as often as it should have been, but I did not make scenes. I did not give anyone a clip they could use. 3 weeks before the hearing, Amy called. Her voice had the shaking quality it had the first time. She said, "You need to know what just happened." That morning, Diane had shown up at Amy's apartment, unannounced. Amy had opened the door, and there was Diane at the threshold with an envelope. And on Amy's kitchen table, Diane had laid out $2,000 in cash, and she'd told Amy what she needed her to do. She needed Amy to go on record saying that the screenshots had been fabricated, that she'd made up the messages, that she'd been angry at Jessica for some unrelated reason and had invented the whole thing to cause trouble in the marriage. Amy said that when she realized what was happening, she had set her phone face down on the counter, which Diane couldn't see, and hit record. Diane had been very clear. $2,000, a statement to the court, and the family would forgive Amy for what she'd done. She'd used the word forgive. She'd said it more than once. Amy had gotten all of it. I called Rebecca from the parking lot of a grocery store in the rain. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, "This changes things considerably. Jessica found out about the recording the night before the hearing. I don't know how. I think Caleb must have been in the apartment, or Diane said something on a family call. However it happened, Jessica found out. And Amy called me at 11 o'clock that night, her voice doing something I'd never heard it do before, something between fury and grief. And she said, she called me. She said if I walk into that courtroom tomorrow, she will never speak to me again. She said I'm dead to her." She paused. She said, "I'll be there at 8:30. The hearing itself was contained and procedural the way legal things are when the evidence is overwhelming. The texts, the police report, my father's video, the audio recording of Diane's bribery attempt in Amy's kitchen." Rebecca presented each one with the flat precision of someone stacking stones, and I watched the judge's expression shift incrementally with each one. Not dramatic, just solidifying, the way a decision looks when it's becoming final. Jessica's attorney argued that the texts were private communications taken out of context. The judge asked whether the authenticity of the screenshots was in dispute. Jessica's attorney said no. The judge thanked him for clarifying. Diane's testimony was not helpful to Jessica's case. The interim parenting plan gave me equal parenting time, with a clear order that neither parent could restrict the other parent's family from contact with the child during their parenting time. It was not everything. It was not nothing. Jessica did not look at me when we left the courtroom. Amy was sitting on a bench in the hallway, still in her coat, her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup she wasn't drinking. She looked like someone who'd just done something that had cost her exactly what she'd known it would cost her. I sat down next to her. I didn't know what to say that was adequate. I said, "Thank you." She nodded. She said, "She's my sister. I've known her for 29 years. She looked down at the cup. "I know exactly who she is. I've always known. I just thought," she stopped. "I don't know what I thought. I understood that. I understood it completely." In the months that followed, the landscape shifted in the incremental, unglamorous way that real life shifts. Jessica and I began the formal divorce process. The marital assets were frozen pending resolution, which meant the $63,000 came back into play in ways that were complicated and ongoing. My attorney was excellent. The process was expensive and slow and required documentation of everything. My parents had Nadia on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and every other weekend starting Friday. My mother had a spot in the backyard where she'd started a small garden, tomatoes, herbs, some flowers, and she told me once, very quietly, that she'd planted it so Nadia would have something to watch grow. My father, who had never been a particularly demonstrative man, took more photographs in those months than in the previous decade. He had albums on his phone organized by date. My grandmother had come through her surgery. She'd been in rehab for 6 weeks afterward, and when she finally came home, I drove Nadia to see her. She held Nadia in her lap in the blue chair by her window and looked at her for a long time without saying anything. I sat in the chair across from her and didn't say anything either. Eventually, she said, "She has your ears." I said I was sorry it had taken so long. She waved the apology away, said she hadn't worried. I said, "You didn't know that it would work out." She said, "No, but worrying doesn't help anything." She was 92. She'd lived enough to know. Priya came back in the spring. She didn't stay in a hotel this time. She stayed in my guest room, the room that had become mine during those terrible weeks in a house that no longer felt like mine. And in the mornings, she sat with Nadia at the kitchen table and fed her small pieces of banana and talked to her in the soft, unhurried way people talk to very young children. I watched from the doorway once and didn't interrupt. Some things don't need a witness to be real, but it helped to be one. The divorce was finalized 11 months after the night in our living room, when Jessica had told me to apologize or face the consequences. By then, the bitterness of it had become something else. Not acceptance exactly, not peace, but something more like comprehension. I understood what had happened. I understood that Jessica had not been operating from cruelty in the simple sense, but from a wound that had been given too much room. What had happened to her with Derek and his mother had been real. The damage it left was real, but she'd taken that damage and built something with it, something methodical and calculated and secret, and that was the part that I couldn't excuse, not because I didn't understand it, because I understood it too well. I think about what our daughter will one day know about this period. I think about what I want her to know, and what I want her never to have to carry. I can't control all of it. I can only control what I do in the time I have with her. The consistency, the steadiness, the proof of presence. Amy and Jessica have not spoken since the courthouse hallway. I don't know if they ever will. I send Amy a text on her birthday, and she responds. That's the shape of what we are to each other now. It's not nothing. Jessica made a promise to herself after Derek, in the wreckage of that first broken engagement, that no mother-in-law would ever touch her life again, and she kept that promise. She kept it so thoroughly that she hollowed out her own marriage and handed a judge the evidence to hold against her in open court. That's what that kind of wound does when you build your life around it instead of through it. It doesn't protect you. It just detonates you from the inside eventually and takes everything nearby with it. I'm not writing this to make her the villain of her own story. She was a person in pain who made decisions that caused more pain. So do most people in the end. The difference is whether you recognize it. Nadia is 18 months old now. She's walking. She claps when she's pleased with something. She says ba for bottle and da for my father, and something that might be mama for either of us. We can't tell yet. My mother's garden came up in the spring. Nadia sat in the dirt and watched a tomato plant the way small children watch things they don't have the words for yet, completely, with everything she had. Some things were lost that can't be recovered. 3 weeks of my grandmother's time with her great-granddaughter. My sister's 4 days in a hotel she packed up alone. The version of my marriage I thought I was inside. Those are real losses. I don't need to dress them up as lessons. They were just losses. But Nadia knows her grandparents. She knows her Aunt Priya. She knows a blue chair by a window and a woman with white hair who holds her carefully and doesn't say much. She'll grow up knowing all of it. That part was worth every single thing it cost.